I never imagined that a quiet suburban street, the kind where neighbors waved politely and children rode bikes without fear, could become the stage for one of the most stressful days of my life. And yet that morning, as I stepped outside to enjoy the crisp air and the gentle sunlight reflecting off the freshly washed hood of my Jeep, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather, a sense that something was off, a tension in the air that I couldn't shake. And then I saw her, Karen, standing across the street with that familiar haughty expression, the kind that always made my skin crawl, her arms crossed, eyes narrowing in judgment as if she had been waiting for this exact moment for weeks. And I immediately knew that whatever petty HOA squabbles we had dealt with in the past were about to escalate into something far more serious, because Karen wasn't just the neighborhood busybody. She was the type who believed rules were meant to be enforced personally, with an almost alarming sense of righteousness that left no room for reason. And she had chosen my property as her next target, as if she had been counting the days, plotting, scheming. And I felt a knot form in my stomach as I walked toward my Jeep, my hands brushing over the smooth metal, trying to ground myself, trying to convince myself that I was overreacting, that it was just another HOA disagreement that would blow over with a polite conversation or a letter. But deep down I knew better. I had learned over the past few months that Karen thrived on control, on pushing boundaries, and she had a way of turning minor infractions into full-blown battles that left everyone around her drained and frustrated. And this time I had a feeling that it wasn't going to be different, especially because of the way she was staring at my Jeep, her gaze sharp and calculating, as if she saw it as a symbol of defiance, something she could claim as hers to correct. And it wasn't just my imagination. I had noticed the signs long before this, the little notes on my door about lawn rules I hadn't even known existed, the thinly veiled threats about paint colors and fence heights, the way she lingered a little too long in her patrols of the neighborhood, watching, observing, always making me feel like I was being measured against some impossible standard. And I had brushed it off at first, thinking that if I ignored her, if I stayed polite and kept my head down, she would eventually move on. But clearly she had different plans, and now the air between us was thick with unspoken tension, an invisible line that I had unknowingly crossed. And as I stood there, heart racing, I noticed a few neighbors looking on from their driveways, faces cautious, curious, and uncomfortable, some murmuring quietly to each other, all aware that Karen had the reputation for taking things too far, for escalating situations far beyond what any reasonable person would. And I could feel the weight of their eyes, as if they were silently warning me, as if they were thinking that this was going to be another one of those HOA confrontations that ended with tears and frustration and maybe even police involvement. And yet no one dared step in, leaving me alone with the growing sense of dread, with the knowledge that I was on my own in facing what Karen had decided was her mission. And as I reached my Jeep, brushing my hand over the lock and the familiar dents and scratches that told the story of long drives and weekend adventures, I realized that this vehicle, my pride and my escape, had somehow become a symbol of rebellion in her eyes, a challenge to her authority that I hadn't even intended, and the thought of someone taking it, someone cutting the lock, someone crossing that invisible line that I had never imagined anyone would, made my stomach twist with anxiety, and I couldn't stop imagining the worst, the fear of waking up the next day to find it gone. Gone as if it had never existed. And in that moment, the quiet of the street seemed heavier, almost suffocating, like the calm before a storm, and I could hear my own breathing sharp and fast as I considered my options, realizing that there was no easy way out, that if Karen had decided to act, there was little I could do to stop her, because she wasn't reasoning. She was acting on impulse, on obsession, and suddenly the entire neighborhood felt like a chessboard, and I was a piece she wanted to move, and I could feel my pulse quicken, adrenaline surging as I thought back to the small incidents that had led here, the notes, the whispers, the passive-aggressive comments about my landscaping and driveway, the small suggestions that I was breaking the rules even when I wasn't, and it all added up to this moment, standing alone in the driveway, knowing that something was about to happen, something I couldn't predict, something that would change everything about how I saw my neighborhood, my neighbors, and even myself. And as I turned my head to glance at her once more, I saw her smirk, a subtle but unmistakable expression of confidence, as if she already knew she had the upper hand. And in that instant, I realized that this wasn't just about a Jeep or an HOA rule or even pride. It was about power, control, and the lengths some people would go to assert it. And I had a sinking feeling that I was about to witness just how far Karen was willing to go, and that whatever happened next, it would be unforgettable, because the quiet streets I thought I knew had suddenly become a battlefield, and I was standing right in the center of it, completely unprepared, completely exposed, and completely aware that the events that were about to unfold would test my patience, my courage, and my sense of justice in ways I had never imagined possible. I could feel my hands trembling slightly as I locked my front door behind me, trying to steady my racing heart. But it was no use, because as I stepped back onto the porch and looked across the street, Karen had already started moving toward my driveway, her stride purposeful, her eyes fixed on the Jeep as if it were a prize she had been promised. And I knew in that instant that whatever boundaries I had assumed existed in this neighborhood had been obliterated, because she didn't hesitate, didn't glance at neighbors who were now peering cautiously from windows and yards. She simply walked with a sense of entitlement that made my stomach knot with dread, and I could feel every second stretching out as though the world itself had slowed down just to let me watch the inevitable unfold. And I wanted to call out to her, to demand she stop, to remind her that my property wasn't hers to touch. But my voice caught in my throat, and even if I had spoken, I doubted she would have listened, because she never had before, always convinced that she was enforcing justice, that she was protecting the neighborhood. And I had tried reasoning with her countless times, explaining that I followed every rule, that I respected boundaries. Yet each conversation ended with her smirk, a thinly veiled threat, a reminder that she could push me further than I thought. And now that push was about to take a dangerous turn, because as she reached the gate, I saw her reach for her tool belt, and my heart sank when I recognized the shape of bolt cutters, the sound of metal against metal ringing in my ears before she even touched them. And panic surged through me as I considered running for help, dialing the police, but even that felt futile, because by the time anyone arrived, she would have acted, and the Jeep, my hard-earned freedom on wheels, would be gone. And I was struck with a mixture of disbelief and anger at the audacity, the sheer disregard for rules, common sense, and basic decency. And as she positioned herself over the lock, I could see the focus in her eyes, the way her jaw was tight, the way she measured every movement as though the lock were the only obstacle standing between her and victory. And I felt trapped, powerless, and yet strangely furious, a fiery determination rising within me that I wouldn't let this slide, that I had to do something, even if I didn't know what, even if my options felt impossibly limited, because I realized in that moment that the situation had escalated far beyond neighborly disagreement, far beyond petty HOA disputes, and was quickly becoming a matter of principle, of control, of asserting that I wasn't going to be intimidated or robbed under the guise of enforcement. And then it happened, the lock snapped, the sound sharp and final, and my chest tightened as she pulled open the gate, stepping onto my property with a confidence that made every nerve in my body scream. And I thought of all the months I had spent restoring the Jeep, the weekends of hard labor and exhaustion, the small victories that felt like freedom as I drove down empty streets, and suddenly all of it felt threatened, fragile, hanging by a thread in the hands of someone who didn't care about my life or the effort I had poured into it. And I wanted to yell, to scream, to make her understand the consequences of her actions, but my throat refused to cooperate, and I could only watch as she ran her hand over the Jeep, as if inspecting it for flaws, as if confirming that it was now hers to control. And a cold wave of dread washed over me because I realized that her interference could lead to repercussions far beyond the neighborhood. That property lines, rules, and petty power struggles aside, she was crossing lines I never thought she would, lines that could involve law enforcement, accountability, and consequences I had never anticipated. And while all of this churned inside me, I felt a surreal sense of clarity, a sudden understanding that this was no longer about keeping the peace. It was about survival, about asserting my rights and my boundaries in a way I had never been forced to before. And yet, as the minutes stretched and neighbors whispered, watching from behind curtains and fences, I felt isolated, alone in the middle of a conflict that had grown from whispers and small annoyances into something tangible, something frightening, something that threatened to undo the careful balance of my life. And I tried to imagine the conversation that would follow, imagining her justifications, the excuses she would concoct to defend her actions, the ways she would insist she was right and I was wrong, and the frustration of knowing that no reasoning would penetrate her self-assured armor made my blood boil. But I also knew I had to stay calm, to think strategically, because panic wouldn't help me. And then the impossible happened, the moment that made everything surreal. As she climbed into the driver's seat of my Jeep, still wearing that triumphant smirk, turning the keys over in her hand, and for a heartbeat, I froze, unable to process the audacity, the violation, the sheer recklessness, and then instinct kicked in. A surge of adrenaline that made my muscles tense and my mind race, trying to figure out how to stop her, to reclaim what was mine, to prevent the disaster. I feared, and I realized that whatever steps I took next would define the rest of the day, the rest of our neighborhood interactions, and possibly even the course of my life, because someone who acted with this level of disregard could escalate beyond anything I had imagined, and the thought of the Jeep disappearing down the street, of her claiming it as a trophy, of neighbors watching silently as my life was invaded, made me feel cornered, vulnerable, and furious all at once. And I knew that I couldn't let fear paralyze me, that I had to act, even if I didn't know exactly how, because every second I hesitated was a second she gained control. And as the engine hummed beneath her hands, I realized that this wasn't just an HOA argument anymore. It was a test of courage, resilience, and resolve, and that if I wanted to survive this ordeal with my dignity intact, I had to confront the reality that Karen had gone too far, that rules and reason had no power against someone like her in this moment, and that the next choices I made would either protect me, my property, and my peace, or allow chaos and obsession to dictate the outcome. And with that thought burning in my mind, I stepped forward, knowing that what happened next would change everything. That the calm street I had walked on just hours earlier had vanished, replaced by tension, uncertainty, and the knowledge that I was now at the mercy of Karen's obsession. A lesson I wasn't prepared to learn, but one I was about to live through in real time. That I felt a surge of panic as Karen shifted the Jeep into gear, her eyes glinting with a mixture of triumph and defiance, and for a moment I considered running after her, yelling, even risking a confrontation that could spiral out of control. But something inside me told me that this wasn't a simple theft or a petty HOA quarrel anymore. This was someone testing limits, crossing lines that shouldn't be crossed, and I realized with a sinking feeling that any wrong move could escalate the situation beyond repair. That my fear and adrenaline were clouding my judgment, and I needed a plan, even as my hands trembled and my mind raced, trying to process how someone could be so reckless, so certain of her own power, so blind to the consequences. And then I noticed it, the way she kept glancing over her shoulder, almost daring me to intervene, almost mocking the fact that I had no immediate solution. And it hit me that she wasn't just stealing a vehicle, she was asserting dominance, playing a game where the stakes were my patience, my pride, and my sense of safety. And I could feel my chest tighten as I weighed my options, realizing that calling authorities could take too long, that neighbors would only watch silently as events spiraled, and that confronting her directly could trigger a confrontation I wasn't ready for. Yet the Jeep was moving slowly down the street, inch by inch, giving me time I wasn't sure I deserved, and I began to consider the small tactical advantages I had, the knowledge of the neighborhood's layout, the side streets, the timing of traffic, the things that could give me a chance to regain control. But before I could act, Karen's expression changed, a flicker of something unexpected passing over her face, and I noticed her hands tighten on the wheel as she muttered something under her breath. A word I couldn't hear, a motion that hinted at frustration, and for a split second, I saw her vulnerability, the tiniest crack in the armor she had built around herself. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by her smug, infuriating confidence, and I felt my anger spike, realizing that this wasn't going to be solved with reason, that her mind was locked in a cycle of obsession and control that refused logic. And then a twist made my stomach drop, as a car I hadn't noticed swerved around the corner, forcing her to brake abruptly, the sudden jerk causing her to curse under her breath. And in that instant, I saw an opening, a sliver of opportunity to intervene safely, to assert my rights without risking a head-on confrontation, and I bolted, heart hammering, toward the Jeep, keeping low, watching for any sudden moves. And as I reached the driver's side, I could feel the vibration of the engine beneath her hands, the heat of the metal, the undeniable reality that this moment was charged with tension and danger unlike anything I had experienced before. And I shouted, my voice firm and sharp, demanding that she stop, and for a heartbeat, I thought she might, the engine idling as she paused, turning her head slightly, eyes meeting mine, and I swear I saw the tiniest flicker of doubt cross her face. But then she laughed, a sharp, cruel sound, and shifted the Jeep into reverse, forcing me to leap back, the tires skimming dangerously close to my feet, and I felt a wave of terror I couldn't shake, the realization that she had no intention of surrendering, that she thrived on this chaos, and I needed to escalate, needed to find a way to protect myself, my property, and my sanity, while still avoiding disaster. And then the twist that made my blood run cold hit me. The Jeep with her at the wheel wasn't just a personal vehicle. It was part of a police task force operation I had been assigned to, a fact that I had never revealed. And suddenly the stakes skyrocketed from neighborhood drama to something far larger, something that could have legal, professional, and personal consequences that I wasn't sure either of us were ready to face. And I felt a mix of relief and dread, relief that the vehicle itself was designed for safety and tracking, but dread because Karen was now an unwitting player in something far beyond her understanding, and I knew that if she made a wrong turn, if she drove into the wrong place, if she provoked the wrong person, the fallout could be catastrophic, and I had to think fast, had to act decisively, had to find a way to de-escalate while still reclaiming control. And as she maneuvered down the street, I noticed the neighbors emerging from their homes, whispering urgently, gesturing, and some moving to intervene, but most frozen, unsure how to help without putting themselves at risk. And I realized in that moment that I was utterly alone in handling the immediate threat, that the responsibility rested entirely on my shoulders, and panic threatened to overwhelm me. But I fought it back, focusing on timing, on positioning, on reading her movements, every small flick of her hand, every glance over the shoulder, every hesitation, because it was in those moments I could find leverage. And then she made a sudden decision, turning onto a side street I hadn't expected, and my heart lurched, because it was a narrow road with parked cars on either side. And I could see the anxiety in her posture now, the confidence fading ever so slightly as the Jeep navigated the tight space, tires scraping close to the curbs, and I realized that despite her bravado, she was unprepared for real pressure, and that knowledge gave me a spark of hope, even as terror coursed through me, and I sprinted alongside, keeping pace. As best I could, shouting again, trying to make my presence known, hoping to jolt her into stopping, and it worked. For a split second, her foot hovering over the brake, the engine growling, hesitation flashing across her face, and I felt a rush of possibility. The sense that this conflict, chaotic and personal as it was, could be resolved without catastrophe if I stayed sharp, stayed calm, and acted with precision. But the realization also hit me hard that Karen had no idea what she was driving, no idea how high the stakes truly were, and that made every second more dangerous, more unpredictable, more intense, because one wrong turn, one snap decision on her part, could turn this from a tense neighborhood clash into a life-altering disaster. And as I continued to maneuver, shouting, assessing, and trying to anticipate her next move, I knew that this was far from over, that the conflict was only deepening, and that the next few minutes would determine whether I could reclaim my Jeep, restore order, and survive the escalating tension without it spiraling entirely out of control. I felt my chest tighten as I struggled to keep pace with the Jeep, my mind racing, my legs burning, and then it happened, the moment that changed everything, because in the middle of the side street, Karen's expression shifted in a way I hadn't anticipated, the confidence that had driven her actions all morning faltering for the first time, and I saw her glance at the dashboard, at the equipment I had installed, and then her eyes widened in disbelief, a flicker of panic overtaking the smugness, and I froze for a heartbeat, unsure if I should call out or let the realization take hold. But it was too late, because the sudden jolt of recognition hit her like a wave, and I heard her gasp sharply, the sound carrying in the quiet street as she muttered words I couldn't fully hear, but the meaning was clear, that she had no idea the Jeep she had just stolen was part of a police task force operation, a vehicle used for investigations, tracking, and assignments far beyond the reach of any neighborhood squabble, and the knowledge that she had just placed herself in the middle of something serious sent a chill through me, because I knew immediately that this escalated everything, that the petty drama I had feared was now entwined with law enforcement in a way that neither of us could ignore, and I saw the panic in her eyes grow as she fumbled with the gear, the engine idling too loudly, tires skidding slightly as she tried to regain control, and in that instant, I realized that the balance of power had shifted, that the fear I had carried since she first touched my Jeep could now be turned into a cautious advantage. But it was also terrifying, because I knew that any wrong move could provoke a dangerous reaction, not from me, but from the unseen authorities connected to this vehicle, and I had to act with precision, with clarity, keeping my own adrenaline in check as I approached the driver's side cautiously, shouting her name, trying to ground her, trying to make her understand without pushing her into panic, and she froze, the brake pressed hard, and for a fleeting second, the street seemed suspended in time, neighbors peeking from behind curtains, whispering urgently, watching a moment that felt cinematic in its intensity. A private drama unfolding in plain sight, and I could feel my own heart hammering as I realized that my Jeep, had become a symbol far larger than I had intended. That it wasn't just property anymore. It was leverage, it was a key to survival, it was a tool that could make or break this confrontation in a way that demanded caution and respect. And as I spoke, my voice steady but firm, explaining that this wasn't an ordinary vehicle, that it was part of a law enforcement operation. I saw the disbelief in her eyes transform into something else, something heavier, like the realization of the potential consequences for her actions, and I could see her hands trembling slightly on the wheel as she absorbed the truth. The enormity of the mistake she had made, and I felt a mix of vindication, fear, and relief wash over me, because the tables had turned. Yet the danger hadn't passed, because one wrong reaction from her or from anyone connected to this Jeep could still spiral into disaster. And in that tense moment, a siren sounded in the distance, a faint wail that grew louder with every heartbeat, and my stomach dropped because I knew that help was on the way. Not just to reclaim property, but to assert authority, to remind both of us that actions had consequences far beyond personal disputes. And I watched as Karen's face went pale, her previous arrogance replaced by real fear, her hands shaking as she struggled to keep the Jeep stationary, and I felt a surge of both sympathy and frustration, realizing that this was the result of obsession and ignorance colliding, that her need to control, to dominate, had blindsided her to realities she hadn't considered. And as the sirens drew closer, I could see the neighborhood holding its collective breath, the quiet streets that had seemed safe hours ago now alive with tension. Eyes glued to the scene, whispering, judging, wondering if this would end peacefully or erupt into chaos. And in that charged silence, I made a choice. A decision that balanced courage, strategy, and the desire to resolve the situation without disaster. Stepping closer, my hands raised slightly, my voice calm but insistent, guiding her, telling her to keep the Jeep stationary, to wait, to breathe, and for a moment, I saw her falter, indecision flashing in her eyes, the realization that she had been reckless, impulsive, and unprepared, and that this moment could define her reputation, her safety, and our neighborhood's fragile order. And then came the final twist, the unmistakable sound of authoritative voices, firm and commanding, approaching from multiple directions, and I felt the adrenaline spike anew, knowing that this confrontation had shifted entirely, that the petty HOA battle had evolved into something far greater, a reckoning that demanded respect, attention, and immediate response. And I could see Karen's body language change, the subtle slump of shoulders, the way her hands gripped the wheel, the tremor in her lips as she realized that her choices had consequences far beyond her imagination. And I felt an odd mixture of triumph, relief, and lingering fear, because the shift had happened, the turning point had arrived, and I understood with a clarity that left me breathless that the outcome of this day, the resolution of this chaos, would not be determined by anger, by stubbornness, or by petty arguments, but by strategy, courage, and the unfolding truth that neither of us could control entirely. And in that suspended moment, with the sirens growing louder, neighbors watching in tense anticipation, and Karen confronting the reality of her actions, I knew that the story we had stumbled into was about to reach heights neither of us had expected, and that what happened next would define not only the fate of my Jeep, but the boundaries of obsession, authority, and the hidden consequences that could erupt when ordinary lives collided with forces far larger than anyone imagined. I could feel my heart hammering in my chest as the sirens drew closer, the wail of authority cutting through the tension like a knife, and Karen's hands shook visibly on the wheel, her eyes wide with panic, and I realized in that instant that all the bravado she had carried through the morning had evaporated, leaving nothing but raw fear and confusion, and I knew that I had only a brief window to act, to prevent disaster, because one wrong move from her, one panicked swerve, could turn this from a tense neighborhood confrontation into a catastrophe. And I stepped closer, keeping my voice calm but commanding, urging her to stop, to breathe, to put the Jeep in park, and I could see her hesitating, the engine idling roughly as she struggled to process the reality that she had stolen a vehicle tied to a police operation. And, in that moment, the weight of the situation hit me fully, how quickly ordinary disputes could spiral into life-altering events, how fragile control really was, and then, with a sudden jerk, the Jeep lurched as she attempted to shift gears, and I instinctively lunged to steady the door, gripping it tightly as my adrenaline surged, feeling every vibration of the vehicle, every tremor in her panic, and I shouted again, telling her she needed to stop, that authorities were on their way, that this was bigger than any HOA rule, and I saw the tiniest spark of clarity cross her face, a flicker of comprehension, as if she suddenly understood that the consequences of her actions stretched far beyond our street, beyond my property, beyond even herself. And then, just as the first police vehicles rounded the corner, lights flashing and engines roaring, I felt a wave of relief and dread crash over me simultaneously, because the presence of law enforcement meant resolution, but it also meant that every choice, every movement, would now be scrutinized, and I had to make sure nothing spiraled further, that neither of us made a misstep in these critical seconds, and Karen's body language shifted again, shoulders slumping slightly, hands gripping the wheel with less confidence, and I could see the panic in her eyes begin to give way to the weight of accountability, the sudden understanding that this was no longer about control or petty rules, but about responsibility, law, and the invisible, boundaries that most people never test, and I felt my own pulse racing as the officers approached, commanding her to step out, to relinquish control, and I watched, tense and apprehensive, as she hesitated, then obeyed, stepping out of the Jeep with a mixture of shame, fear, and disbelief etched into her features, the reality of the morning finally hitting her fully, and I exhaled, my chest heaving with tension and relief, as I finally saw the Jeep secure, the engine cut, and my property, my freedom on wheels, no longer under threat, and yet the aftermath was just beginning because neighbors had gathered, murmuring anxiously, whispering theories, and staring in a mix of judgment, astonishment, and relief, and I felt a strange mix of vindication and unease, because while the immediate danger had passed, the emotional scars, the shaken trust, and the awareness of how quickly chaos could erupt lingered, heavy and palpable, and the officers spoke with both of us, explaining the severity of what had occurred, the potential legal ramifications, the dangers of her reckless actions, and I watched Karen's face pale, realizing that her obsession with control, her arrogance, and her need to assert power had nearly resulted in a disaster that none of us were prepared for. And I could feel the anger and frustration I had held all morning slowly morph into a strange sense of empathy, because despite her recklessness, her panic, and the chaos she caused, she was still human, flawed, and overwhelmed by the sudden magnitude of the situation she had created. And I realized in that moment how fragile civility can be, how easily ordinary lives can intersect with forces far beyond our comprehension, and that even a small act, a stolen vehicle, a lapse in judgment, could ripple outward with consequences no one anticipates. And as the officers left, taking statements and giving warnings, and as Karen was escorted to a nearby spot to process what had happened, I felt a complicated mixture of triumph, relief, and exhaustion, because I had survived the confrontation, reclaimed my Jeep, and faced the escalation without losing my composure. But I also recognized the subtle shift in the neighborhood's energy, the way people now regarded each other with caution, awareness, and perhaps a little respect for boundaries that had previously been taken for granted. And I thought about how quickly the ordinary can become extraordinary, how a quiet morning can turn into a life lesson, and as I slid into the driver's seat of my Jeep, feeling the familiar contours of the leather, the hum of the engine, I let myself exhale fully, allowing the tension to drain from my shoulders, and I reflected on the emotional roller coaster of the morning, the fear, the adrenaline, the near disaster, and the sense of control restored, and I understood that this day, this confrontation with Karen, had changed something fundamental, not just in the neighborhood dynamic, but in how I viewed my own resilience, my ability to stay calm under pressure, and my awareness that life can throw unpredictable challenges in the most mundane places, and that sometimes the line between ordinary and extraordinary, between safety and chaos, is thinner than anyone realizes. And as I drove slowly down the street, neighbors watching quietly from their driveways, I felt a sense of closure, a hard-won lesson about boundaries, about the consequences of obsession, and about the unpredictable ways ordinary lives can collide with forces we never expect. And I knew that the fallout of this event would linger in whispers, judgments, and reflections for weeks, but for now, in the moment when the Jeep was secure and the chaos had passed, I allowed myself a deep, steady breath, the weight of the morning settling into memory, knowing that while the conflict had reached its peak, the emotional impact, the lessons learned, and the awareness of how fragile peace really was, would stay with me forever, and that I had survived, not just physically, but emotionally, navigating the storm with courage, presence, and the clarity that comes only after a confrontation with the unexpected. The morning after the chaos, the neighborhood felt eerily quiet, as if the streets themselves were holding their breath, and I stood on my porch, sipping coffee, feeling the warmth seep into my hands while my mind replayed every moment from the previous day, the fear, the adrenaline, and the sharp edge of anger that had driven me to stay calm yet assertive, and I realized that something fundamental had shifted, not just in my own perspective, but in the way neighbors regarded each other and the unspoken rules we all lived by, because Karen, who had once patrolled the streets with a sense of authority that bordered on intimidation, now moved quietly, cautiously, aware that her actions had consequences far beyond the petty disputes she had thrived on. And I could see it in her posture, the subtle hesitation in her steps, the way she avoided meeting my eyes directly, and while part of me felt vindicated, another part of me felt the weight of understanding, that her obsession with control had been driven by fear, insecurity, and a need to assert power over a world she perhaps felt she couldn't fully manage. And as I reflected on that, I realized that my own life had changed too, that the morning's events had forced me to confront not just her recklessness, but my own boundaries, my own courage, and the importance of standing firm when ordinary life threatens to spiral into chaos. And I felt a strange sense of clarity and calm, a recognition that while I couldn't control every action of those around me, I could control my own responses, my own decisions, and the way I navigated difficult situations with patience and awareness. And as the days passed, the tension in the neighborhood slowly softened, neighbors exchanging cautious smiles instead of whispers, the quiet acknowledgement that something extraordinary had happened without anyone being hurt, and I found myself forging a subtle, unspoken understanding with Karen, a recognition that while our interactions had once been dominated by petty conflict, there was now a line neither of us could cross, a fragile respect born from the events of that day, and I felt a renewed appreciation for the ordinary peace I had once taken for granted, for the quiet mornings spent sipping coffee on the porch, for the knowledge that my Jeep, now parked safely in the driveway, symbolized more than a vehicle or a hobby. It represented resilience, patience, and the ability to face unexpected challenges with composure. And I realized that the stakes we face in life are often hidden beneath layers of routine, that ordinary people can find themselves in extraordinary circumstances when decisions, obsessions, and unforeseen events collide. And this understanding gave me a sense of empowerment, a reminder that vigilance, calm, and careful judgment can turn potential disaster into a lesson learned. And as I walked down the street that afternoon, nodding politely to neighbors who now offered quiet smiles rather than judgmental glances, I felt a renewed connection to the community, a sense that the neighborhood, like all human interactions, is delicate yet resilient, capable of surviving conflict when boundaries are respected and lessons are absorbed. And I thought about how easily control can slip from our hands, how quickly ordinary days can become defining moments, and yet, with reflection, I found gratitude, a recognition that the tension, fear, and confrontation had ultimately strengthened my understanding of myself, of others, and of the invisible threads that connect our actions to consequences we may not immediately see. And I realized that while Karen's obsession had threatened to dominate my morning and my peace, it had inadvertently forced a reckoning, a reset of awareness, boundaries, and perspective that left the neighborhood calmer, more cautious, but also more human, more empathetic. And as I reached my Jeep, running my hand across the familiar metal, I felt not just relief, but a quiet pride, recognition that I had faced fear, confrontation, and chaos with integrity, that I had navigated the storm without losing myself, and that the lessons carried beyond the street, beyond this neighborhood, into every part of life where control, judgment, and human imperfection intersect, and I allowed myself a slow, deep breath, savoring the peace that had returned, knowing that the memory of the ordeal would linger as a reminder of the fragility and resilience of daily life, the unpredictability of human behavior, and the strength that comes from facing challenges with clarity, courage, and patience. And as the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the quiet streets, I felt a profound sense of closure, a calm that was hard-won and deeply satisfying, and I understood that life, much like that morning with Karen in the Jeep, is a series of tests, moments where ordinary choices intersect with extraordinary circumstances, and it is in how we navigate those moments, how we respond to chaos, and how we maintain our integrity that we define not only the outcome, but the person we become. And I knew, as I turned the key in the ignition and felt the familiar hum of the Jeep beneath me, that this chapter had closed, but the lessons would remain, echoing in quiet awareness, in careful reflection, and in the knowledge that strength, calm, and perspective are the true measures of triumph in any conflict, ordinary or extraordinary. Weeks had passed since the morning when everything spiraled out of control, yet the memory of that day lingered in a way that was impossible to ignore, a quiet echo in the back of my mind that reminded me how quickly ordinary life could be disrupted and how fragile the balance of civility, trust, and routine really was. And as I walked down the familiar streets of the neighborhood, watching children play and neighbors tending to their lawns, I realized how much had shifted, not in grand, visible ways, but in the subtle changes of awareness, in the careful nods exchanged across driveways, in the way people now seemed more conscious of their words and actions. And even Karen, whose presence had once been a source of constant stress, moved with a quieter energy, no longer patrolling with the same intensity, no longer asserting authority in ways that made everyone else feel smaller or watched. And I recognized that her behavior, though reckless and disruptive, had ultimately catalyzed a subtle transformation in the neighborhood's rhythm, a reminder that conflict, when faced and survived, could lead to growth, reflection, and a deeper understanding of boundaries. And as I glanced at my Jeep parked in its usual spot, I felt a mix of pride and gratitude, because it represented more than a vehicle, more than a property I had fought to protect. It had become a symbol of resilience, of the ability to stay composed under pressure, and of the understanding that fear, anger, and tension could be channeled into thoughtful action. And I reflected on the personal lessons etched into that chaotic morning, the way it had forced me to confront my own instincts, my capacity for patience, my ability to assess risk, and the importance of keeping calm when confronted with unpredictability. And I realized that life often tests us not through monumental disasters but through moments that seem small at first, seemingly ordinary events that reveal the strength, courage, and judgment we might not have known we possessed. And I thought about the ripple effects of our actions, how Karen's choices, driven by obsession and a need for control, had collided with my own decisions, my own awareness, to create a situation that was tense, dangerous, and transformative all at once. And the emotional impact lingered, a combination of relief, pride, lingering frustration, and profound respect for the unpredictability of human behavior. And as I considered how I had responded, I recognized a sense of empowerment, a realization that maintaining integrity, composure, and clarity in the face of chaos not only preserves safety and property but also shapes character, strengthens resolve, and teaches lessons that no ordinary experience could. And I began to see the broader implications, how our reactions to conflict, our ability to navigate tension without succumbing to panic or anger, could influence not just immediate outcomes but long-term relationships, trust, and personal growth. And I found myself thinking about Karen too, imagining how the events had affected her understanding of boundaries, consequences, and the real weight of actions taken without full awareness. And I felt a mix of sympathy and clarity, acknowledging that mistakes, even those born of arrogance or obsession, are opportunities for reflection, change, and sometimes even reconciliation. And as the neighborhood returned to its usual rhythm, the quiet moments, the ordinary interactions, the shared understanding that our small community had weathered a storm and emerged altered but intact, I felt a deep appreciation for the fragility and resilience of everyday life, the way a single morning could reveal strengths, weaknesses, fears, and capacities we had never acknowledged before. And I realized that this experience had left an indelible mark, shaping how I approached conflict, how I valued patience, and how I understood the balance between standing firm and exercising compassion. And even in the months that followed, as I drove my Jeep through familiar streets, I felt a heightened awareness, a sense of vigilance mixed with calm, a reminder that life can change in an instant and that maintaining integrity and composure is both a shield and a compass, guiding us through uncertainty. And I thought about the people around me, neighbors, friends, and strangers, realizing that each interaction carries potential consequences, that ordinary days hold the possibility of extraordinary tests, and that respect, empathy, and awareness are the tools that allow us to navigate them successfully. And finally, I understood that the story of that chaotic morning was more than a tale of theft, fear, or confrontation. It was a lesson in human behavior, resilience, and the power of composure, a testament to the idea that strength is measured not by aggression or dominance, but by the ability to face unexpected challenges with clarity, courage, and thoughtfulness. And as I parked my Jeep at the end of another quiet day, feeling the soft glow of sunset reflecting off the street, I allowed myself to savor the deep sense of peace that had emerged from turmoil, the understanding that life is unpredictable, that conflict is inevitable, and that the way we respond defines not only the outcomes but the kind of people we become. And I knew that the memory of that morning, of Karen, of the Jeep, and of the chaos that had unfolded, would remain with me as a powerful reminder that patience, courage, and integrity are not abstract ideals, but essential tools for navigating the unpredictable. And that even in the face of fear, confusion, and high stakes, it is possible to emerge not only unscathed but stronger, wiser, and deeply aware of the extraordinary lessons hidden in ordinary moments.